Ranged attacks. When you make a ranged attack, you fire a bow or a crossbow, hurl a hand axe, or otherwise send projectiles to strike a foe at a distance. A monster might shoot spines from its tail. Many spells also involve making a ranged attack.
And that is the beginning of Ranged Attacks from page 195 of the 5th edition Player's Handbook. And I am Ben Riggs, writer, historian, father, and Trade Federation droid. And with me, as always, is Dr. Scott Bruner. Dr. Scott, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Good evening.
Great. And with us is the voice of the show, whom you've already heard read a number of things from D&D history for us, uh, Madeleine Craig. How you doing, Madeleine?
I'm doing okay.
Good. And we invited Madeleine on here because she's an actress. She's, like I said, the vocal talent on the show, and also for simple demographic reasons, which is that women under 30 are the fastest increasing demographic in D&D, as far as we know, at least. And for those of us who are over 40, gasp, shudder. We kind of grew up in a time when D&D was 95% male, and a lot of us still playing all male groups. And it's just kind of interesting to hear how the rules of D&D and the practice of D&D is translating to a new generation, which is another reason for having her on here. So, with that, I kind of want to know, do you want to keep reading, or I kind of want to know why you chose ranged attacks for what you wanted to read out loud. It's surprisingly crunchy.
I I mean I specifically I was not sure what I wanted to read. And I was talking to a friend of mine and we were trying to think of rules that have frustrated us over the past and we remembered nets. Um because nets are objectively useless unless you take two specific feats. Um because you'll just always be at disadvantage with the way that ranged attacks work.
Wow. And so you chose this because you think it's a particularly broken rule?
I think it's the more I thought about it, I think it's probably purposefully nerfed. But I think it's not one that is obviously so. So it's easy for people to get frustrated with it. I think it's a little deceptive.
Okay. Then with that, I would say, why don't you keep reading, and if we have something to say, we're gonna raise our hands and say something about it.
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna make sure I have my actual file set for that.
Okay, take
So
your time.
then there we are. Okay. Would you like me to continue with ranged attacks, or I can just move right on to nets?
I mean, you read what you think is important.
Okay.
Is
Um,
where are nets? Are they on this page?
Nets, well, the basic description is back on page, I want to say 145. Actually, I have it written down here. 149 is just the basic like cost, et cetera, et cetera. I actually pulled my net information from D&D Beyond because I couldn't find it in my books.
Hey, that's
I
fine.
think
So
it's in the player's handbook, but I, for the life of me, could not find it.
I'm glad you endeavored to. You read whatever you want to read. You read what you think is important.
Cool. All right. So nets are, there we go, a ranged weapon. So a large or smaller creature hit by a net is restrained until it is freed. A net has no effect on creatures that are formless or creatures that are huge or larger. A creature can use its action to make a DC 10 strength check, freeing itself or another creature within its reach on a success. Dealing 5 slashing damage to the net, AC 10, also frees the creature without harming it, ending the effect and destroying the net. When you use an action, bonus action, or reaction to attack with a net, you can only make one attack regardless of the number of attacks you normally make. So it's a 5/15 ranged weapon. So the 5 is its close range where you can just normally like roll to hit, and then the 15 is the longer range where you roll disadvantage. But the thing with ranged attacks is that anything within 5 feet, you automatically have disadvantage. So you just always have disadvantage on a net throw, no matter what you do, unless you have sharpshooter or I believe it's crossbow expert.
And you think that this was purposely nerfed so that it isn't overpowered?
I didn't at first, but restraining is very like it's a big thing to do in combat, and it can really throw off like the other creature or the enemy or the other player even. Um, and so I feel like with something that big of an effect, it would be easy to net spam, if that makes sense. So if, in my personal opinion, upon further reflection, it's not just there to inconvenience me. It's probably for a purpose.
Probably for
But that is my own take. I haven't personally played with the net. I've only talked to players who have.
really. So you've never played with a net, but this rule stands out as being
It's
so.
come up as a DM a couple times. So, yeah,
So you've had
because I
players
don't
that
get
have,
to play often.
yeah. So you're a forever DM.
Yeah.
Huh. And what have you
About
run?
ooh, lots of homebrew. Mostly homebrew. From God for about 6 years, and then I've run Princes of the Apocalypse and Wild Beyond the Witchlight, and I'm planning on running Rime of the Frost Maiden in the near future, if not homebrew again.
So you had players that took nets?
Yes, I had a player way back when I first did homebrew. He was a ranger, and he had kind of like, because it's like my first game, so I was letting him mess around a little bit, and he had kind of done a fisherman ranger build, weirdly, and he took a net as his ranged weapon. We only played a little bit, but it did come up. And
Huh.
then when I was talking to one of my other players before I came on the show, they reminded me. I was like, ah,
And did he take the
disadvantage.
disadvantage? Did he take the requisite feats so he wasn't rolling with disadvantage every single time?
No.
So he was rolling with disadvantage every single time. You said it was his favorite weapon? Off the top, do you recall the bonus for favorite? Hey Scott, do you remember the bonus for a favorite weapon in 5e? Either of
I
you
d-
recall?
uh, I don't, not off the top of my
Yeah,
head. But as
like
always,
I can look.
I'm terrible at remembering
that's
rules,
okay.
which
I
is
was
like
just
I'm
wondering. There's no
always
way
lean
it's
on
gonna.
the players from other stuff.
There's no way it's gonna overcome disadvantage, though, right?
I
No,
can't,
I
well,
don't
I don't
think so.
know. Or is it a feat that you need to take with the 5e? I mean, the 5e rules are, if we're going to talk about 5e rules, this is after five, this is the fifth edition where they're finally kind of, one of the main goals of this thing is to kind of balance them extremely well. And I think that's one of the reasons why the edition is so popular, is because the rules are so well balanced. And I don't disagree, Madeline, that there's probably a lot of nerfing rules. What I become fascinated by is why did they feel they had to nerf them? What it was in. Probably because exactly what you mentioned, which is, players do it, especially after 4 editions, to do such a fantastic job of finding every kind of nook and, or, finding every kind of exploit they possibly can to do it. And so it always makes me wonder, this is a question, if Mike Morales is listening out there, why is the net so fairly unusable? Or is it, I'm almost thinking too that it's possible that the concept was the net should only be used in in unconventional ways, that they weren't thinking that you would use a net as literally like as rolling as straight mechanics. They were hoping that folks would constantly challenging the DM to be like, well, I want to use the nets in a very unconventional manner. What can I do here?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it really reminds me of a lot of the second edition rules, where it would be like, we need to find a reason mechanically for you not to do this thing, which tactically may make a ton of sense.
Mhm.
The second edition rules had a lot of, here's why you can't pick up 2 longswords and use them at the same time, and there's all these rules about dual wielding weapons.
The other thing too
And
is the condition. Not to interrupt you, Ben, really quick.
interrupt me, please interrupt me.
The conditions are so. I mean, it's hard for me not to start with like, I love fifth edition. I do generally. I do run it. I'm running Chris Sister out on Sunday, but but I do have some issues with it. It's interesting because we started with ranged attacks, and the first thing I'm going to think about ranged attacks is I have my biggest pet peeve. Oh, okay, there's a few pet peeves. I loathe cantrips. That's probably my biggest pet peeve. But my second pet peeve is the concept of how easy it is to fire into range combat with weapons. Like if you've played first edition, it was like a 50% chance of who you were going to hit. But I digress. My point, where was my
People are
point?
here for the
Oh,
digression, Scott.
the other thing is the conditions are so weak in fifth edition D&D. Like it's like a strained, like, oh, if you restrain someone, the only condition is that they can't move. The poison condition gives you like disadvantage. In first edition, wow, I'm sounding wonderfully like a grognard right now. But in first edition, if you take poison, you have to make a save or your character is gone. Not to, just have disadvantage on skill checks and combat checks for the rest of the day. I don't know why I'm complaining so much right now.
Now, do you know how Restrained was different at all? I have no idea about first edition. I've only really
Oh,
played with a little bit with 3.5.
I mean, the conditions have
Kind of.
changed. One of the things that's great about fifth edition is the fact that the conditions are so explicit. Like this is exactly what's happening, and I guess this kind of comes back to my original point is, 5e is great because it is balanced so well. I mean, the designers of 5e are brilliant folks of kind of knowing but we're still talking about like the new school versus old school rules, which was there are a lot of really weird weapons in first edition D&D. I mean, there's a page entire of pole arms and trying to figure out how you actually use a man catcher. The rules were very much at the the DM was constant. It's the old rulings not rules, where that's what's so great about 5e is the rules are so well balanced. It's kind of difficult, and that this brings us back to the net concept, which is that it's hard to break 5e's rules because they're balanced so well, but they are in some ways gamey. Like I would, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this necessarily, but
we never know where we're going with these things, Scott.
yeah, Madeline, you asked me a question about conditions. It's funny you asked me that. And I'm like, I don't know if there were conditions. It was often up to the DM to adjudicate what that
Oh.
would be if you were caught in something. It would be very contextual. Being caught in a net would be very different than being caught in a web, so to speak. So the DM would be constantly kind of making those things. And again, you had such weird weapons, and I mean, I have no idea what the rule necessarily would be. And maybe they are, considering Gary Gygax made a rule for literally everything, there probably was some, rule on page 84 of Unearthed Arcana that said if you're caught in a man catcher, you have to, you lose these things. But generally, no one probably had any idea what those rules were, so we were constantly adjudicating. And that's the I mean, 5e is fantastically elegant. But sometimes it loses flavor in making sure that every rule is so explicitly followed.
Interesting.
Yeah, not to.
Yeah, like I remember one time. I've never actually played first edition, but I'm fascinated with Beckme and that root of the tree. Madeline, are you familiar with Beckme at all?
I am actually not. I would love to know more because that sounds interesting.
So, way back in the day, before there even was a first edition, the rules to original Dungeons and Dragons were getting so complicated and convoluted that the players were like, TSR, you need to like put everything into volumes so we're not looking in Dragon Magazine for rules and the original OD&D box for rules. And gosh, I want to say the traveling above land rules were from a totally different game, the name of which is escaping me. And so that was going to be first edition AD&D. But the idea that a new person was going to pick up first edition AD&D and successfully learn how to run it from reading those books was basically nil. So a guy named Dr. J. Eric Holmes, I forget what he was a doctor of. Do you recall, Scott?
Oh, let's
Was it
turn to the answer
neuroscience,
machine.
neurosurgery?
That sounds like it's possibly
Something
right.
remarkably impressive. He was not a doctor of basket weaving. Sorry, basket weavers.
I've always wondered what happened to him, by the way. Like he came in, he does this set, and that's it.
So he creates a starter set for D&D. Go ahead.
Professor of neurology.
Neurology, neuro something or other. He creates the first starter set, and it was called the I forget what the first one was called actually, but now we call it the Holmes set. That eventually evolved into a starter set, which was called Basic D&D, which was a very simplified version of the game. And that simplified version of the game is a ton of fun, runs real easy, real pretty. And it was codified in a volume called the Rules Cyclopedia in the early 90s. It is, as far as I know, the only one volume version of D&D that was ever published. It had treasures, monsters, experience, everything you would need in one book. And it hums. And the one time I ran that, a player got bit by a spider, and I want to say the rules said they are poisoned. Look up poison on page whatever. I look it up and it's like make a save or they die. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, well that's really straightforward and simple. Here we go. Oh, you died.
I kind of like it.
I know.
I
I
Well,
ran
it's
it. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories, and I've told it on this podcast before. But one of my favorite stories is one of my players had never played, first. He hadn't grown up with first edition. He's much younger. He's in his mid-30s, and I will never forget when his character got bit by a poisonous spider, and he's like, "All right," and we were like, "Oh, make the save rule," and all of us, well, all of the people, everyone else in that group is about my age, so we all know exactly what's happening here. And he makes the save rule. He's like, "I failed." He's like, "So okay, so what does that mean? Do I need to like get a health potion?" And we're like nobody wanted to tell him that he was re-rolling a new character. It was like everyone was kind of looking around awkwardly. But yeah, it was save versus die on the old poison.
So Madeline, do you think that the net
yeah.
in some way breaks suspension of disbelief for you? Are you like, this is so obviously nerfed that it takes me out of the fiction?
No. No, I don't think so. I think it depends on how you're trying to use it, because I think if it's somebody trying to throw it as a ranged weapon, if you are far away and throwing a net and you've got past that 15-foot range or like way too close, like that makes sense for it to maybe get tangled up, etc., like roll disadvantage. But if you're like dropping it from above or something like that, then I think that feels a little broken to me. That feels wrong. So I think it's more of a like, but that's not something you can anticipate with stats. You can't anticipate player usage or the creative ways they're going to use. Like dropping from above isn't even that creative. I can't come up with something that a weird chaotic player is going to do because I can never anticipate it. That's why I prep and then pretend the prep's not there.
I want to
Like
say
it,
though, go ahead, sorry.
no, go on, go on.
I want to say like a second level thief has a really insane climbing ability.
There is one. Yeah, you're right.
Like
Actually,
it'd be pretty easy for a low level thief just clamber up to the ceiling, wait till the baddie comes by, drop net on, then drop down and
yeah,
backstab them.
yeah. Or
You
even
know?
just as basic as a ranger like making a trap.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I don't know how that would change things either if it's not being thrown by the player or if it's something they've set up default. Like, would that change it?
Well, here's my question to you, Madeline. Are the players that you
Yeah,
generally have? I mean, again, background is mostly in fifth edition. Are your characters, are your players generally looking at the rules and thinking within the terms of those boundaries of like, all right, the net
yeah,
can do this thing. I've got to worry about close combat. Do you have folks that are often using a net or any type of weapon or any type of implement or any type of item in
yeah.
the game in unusual fashions? Because this is going to bring me to the
Mhm.
concept of, answer that question, then I'll say where I wanted
Yeah.
to go with it.
So I would say that's sorry, I dropped my charge card. It's player to player. Because I've definitely had players who will like text me for hours each week going, what if I take this one? And then these are all the things that I can do with this. And then these are all the things I could do with this, but I could take this instead, and then that would do this. What do you think? And I'll tell them what I think, but obviously I can't tell them what to do. And then I'll have other players who will take random stuff and in the middle of the session go, oh yeah, I'm gonna cast this spell in this completely random way and somehow it works. Like it's such a varying scale with all my games. I've always had players on either side of the spectrum and some just kind of sit in the middle and kind of do a little bit of both.
Mhm.
It's not something I've ever been able to anticipate except in ways that I know the people that I'm playing with. Like I'm very careful with that. I tend to choose people I know very well to play with. So then I can anticipate that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it's always going to be different person to person. The thing I was going to bring up is, we're talking a little bit about the difference between old editions and new editions, and
Yeah.
there's one of the old, I don't know where this is from. I wish I could give proper attribution or whether this just is a concept that's been floating around for a long time, but it's the difference between combat as sport and combat as war, and we've probably
Oh,
chatted
interesting.
we've I think Ben, you and I probably chatted about this, but I think it runs through the different philosophies between the two books, where or the two editions, which is I'd say fifth edition is very much more the concept of combat as sport. And let me quickly explain, see if I can do a Reader's Digest version of this idea. Ben, are you familiar with these concepts?
No, but I'm Googling it right now.
Okay, so the concept
Can
is
I ask a
this.
question really quickly? I'm so
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt
No,
you, Scott. Is it
please.
does it have to do with like Warhammer and like the origins of like Gary Gygax kind of pulling from that, or is that completely different? Am I on a different track?
No, I mean it's Not entirely. It'd be the
Okay.
concept of going back to, Gygax's wargaming roots, right?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, the idea is in war. War is not fair. I was about to go Fallout there for a second as they say war and pause. Sorry, Fallout's been in my head. But the concept is that war isn't fair and you need to use every tactical advantage to your ability, right? May have more soldiers than the other opponent, so you've got to use the terrain to your best advantage or the weather or whatever. But the concept is that war is not fair, right? And you've got to use literally any advantage you have at your disposal and or create advantages for you. And that's very much kind of an old school philosophy, which is that if you go into a dungeon, the dungeon master's role isn't to make the dungeon fair for you or to make you have a fighting chance. The concept is you don't know what you need to think about. That's a giant spider. I don't necessarily know what its challenge rating is, what its hit points are. Maybe we should do everything we can to have an advantage. And that also means like kind of what we were just talking about ahead is like you could have a thief that could climb up and drop a net. That's thinking in terms of combat as war. Combat versus sport means that you've got two fairly evenly matched teams and it's just a tactical, it's like playing chess. You guys have the same you have the same types of pieces on each side of the board, and whoever can maneuver them best will win. And
Mhm.
D&D, newer editions of tabletop role-playing games versus D&D have definitely moved towards that idea of combat as sport. The whole concept of a challenge rating is very much about creating balance. Well, I've got three I'm the DM and I'm creating an adventure today, so I've got to take this, I've got to make sure that the challenge rating isn't over 20. By the way, challenge ratings are so weirdly the concept that challenge ratings are even that it's even possible to do, I find strange because it really depends on the characters you party, but I digress. The point is that combat as sport means you have two teams, they're fairly evenly matched. You take the tactics. Combat as war means who knows who's evenly matched or who's better. As players, you've got to be afraid of everything and use every tactical advantage to your disposal.
So it looks like the origin of this was a post on EN World back in February of 2012. And the reason those of you who are watching this on video will notice I was smiling so much was because as Scott started to summarize combat as sport, he almost exactly paraphrased the first sentence of the paragraph describing it.
It's really
I'm
funny.
like,
I've never read it on EN World. It was I heard it from my DM Bart, so
let
it's
me
funny.
read the sentence. It was people who want combat as sport want fun fights between two, at least roughly, evenly matched
Yeah.
sides. And as I'm reading that, Scott says evenly matched sides. And again, I for not being a huge D&D guy, in pretty much all of my games, I come down heavily on combat as war.
Yeah.
I have really no interest in combat as sport because once the danger is gone, I think it becomes way less interesting.
Yeah.
Call of Cthulhu in the edition I grew up with had some brutal gunfire rules. Absolutely, like you could fire 3 times faster than you could stab someone, and God help you if you get a shotgun or a machine gun involved. It gets bloody and terrible very quickly. But it's so dramatic, in game when you're like, that cultist has a shotgun. Ah! And you know the terrible things it can do to your intestines. Um, and I'll pick on Matt Colville since he's blocked me on Twitter, and which I will never stop complaining.
I feel like if we're keeping the drinking game going, every time I say entanglement, every time you mention Matt Colville, that's got to be a shot.
But again, in his new Fantasy Heartbreaker game, I think it's the MCDM RPG. You do damage every turn, whether or not you hit.
Interesting.
And he's like, yeah, that way you feel like you're always doing something. You're always getting something done. And this was before he blocked me on Twitter, but that was the moment when I was like, I don't think I'm going to pick that up because it seems so video gamey and so like, oh, well, we want to make sure the players feel okay. So they're always going to do a little bit of damage. So you're always getting something done, players. It feels like the worst of uh some people might call it snowflake thinking.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's so many. I mean, my least favorite player player group are the power fantasy gamers, and it's in many ways that's and I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with that necessarily, except that it's something that I'm extremely not interested in. And it's not just, I mean, I love, classic adventure games, and text games where you can die, King's Quest games where you can die 300 ways.
Oh, I love King's Quest.
See?
Oh, sorry.
That,
That type to play, that's all I had growing up.
Yeah, again, and a joke amongst my peer group is that Madeline, while being a under 30 woman, is culturally a mid 40s male.
It's the way I was raised.
Yeah.
My sisters are in their 40s, grew up in the middle of bum nowhere. Pardon my French.
I'll make a note.
is that a French town?
Yes.
The boom.
I think it's Boomfique,
Yeah,
actually.
it is.
But no, it's I wasn't allowed to play a lot of computer games, so I played like what my sisters had, which was like Zork and King's Quest 3 and
that's my other. I mean, Matt, we should talk about this sometime. Text. So two things that I studied in grad school, and one was tabletop role playing games. The other thing is text adventures is my other love.
I always wanted to like take them and then turn them into a tabletop game because my friends weren't playing King's Quest during the pandemic like I was. And so I was like, I really could just like turn this into the game. But that's like for another project. I think trying to like pull myself back onto what we were talking about, the war versus sport thing. I think I started very much as a sport DM when I was doing only homebrew and I was 18 and I'd never played and I just wanted my friends to like me because it was college. And I just thought it had to be fair. And then I started to run more pre-mades, or at least read more pre-mades and read more rule books. And then as time went on, became more, okay, it doesn't really matter. They have to get creative. This is what is here. What do you do with what you have? And now I'm finally playing again after like 6 years without that. I'm playing a Curse of Strahd right now, actually. And RDM is definitely combat is war. We just had that happen yesterday.
And Strahd,
and it's super fun as a player. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to interrupt. I was footnoting what you were saying, which is one of the reasons I run Strahd on Sunday nights as well. And one of the reasons why, despite the fact 5e isn't usually the game I go to, but I do like it, is Curse of Strahd is very much if you run it as the books, as they call it, raw, as run as written. Strahd is a fairly OSR. It's an open world thing where you can easily venture into the wrong area and you're done. I TPK'd I ran Strahd. I've said this in the podcast before. I ran Strahd for a group who was paying me, and they were all first. This is the first time they'd ever played Dungeons and Dragons, and I TPK'd them in the starter dungeon, and I had no problem doing that.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm mean.
The Catholic guilt wore off after I DM'd for a while. I get it.
Yeah, like early on, I would say I was much more merciful for very similar social reasons. For a long time, I'm going to say I really didn't start to become comfortable with character death until the past 5 years, though. Oh
yeah, I'm still not comfortable with it.
Yeah. Like, I think I'm comfortable with it now because it, if a kid is answering every question in class using some obnoxious voice, I don't know, pick your obnoxious voice. Maybe you're an actress. Can you give me an obnoxious voice?
I'm in a music class. I hear them all day. I don't know. Usually the high pitched up here is really.
That's a good obnoxious voice. But the kid making an obnoxious voice, and you're like, if you do that one more time, I'm gonna call your mom.
That's right.
They do it one more time, and it's like, even though you don't want to call mom because that's punishing you, because it's time you could spend drinking whiskey in the teacher's lounge, you better call mom because the other kids will get the message. And that to me is very similar to the purpose of character death, where it teaches everyone at the table that there are consequences and these things matter. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, sorry. It all depends on the experience that you're trying to create for people. And one of the things that I've realized, first of all, I've never I said that, my least favorite brand of players were power gamers, the folks that are coming into it to have that kind of power fantasy. And I think the combat as sport, as the concept, is like, it's interesting because those of us that kind of grew up with D&D from when we were 13 until now we're, as you know, I've just turned 36, plus or minus 14 years, is the concept of people are still trying to win the game. And I think a lot of people come into, we're interpolated with games that you can win. And I would say, despite the fact that video games have taught us the lexicon of role-playing games, most video game role-playing games are still based on the concept that we're going to, with the initial character that we create at the beginning of the game, going to finish this game with that character, even if we're scum saving, even if we're doing things. And that's very different to, I think, a lot of old school players who were like, yeah, we're probably going to face the final dude at some point, but I may have gone through three characters but before that we ever reach that, and the final dude may win at the end, and it is, and I guess that's the thing, is especially me as a player who, by the way, I've never had like a character ever get past 4th level because my characters die all the time, because I'm a huge fan of like ridiculously narratively, I would say narratively interesting, but epic mythic deaths. My character is literally the tabletop role-playing equivalent of Nicholas Hoult in Fury Road. I'm constantly saying "witness" as I jump onto a bunch of kobolds. Where was I going with this? But I think it's about the different experiences that we're creating for players. And I do think a lot of folks are coming into the hobby new through 5th edition, thinking in terms of like, this is a game I have to defeat. It's got to be fair for me. Where the old folks are like, no, we're kind of more interested in the weirdness of a narrative going in hundreds of different directions. And sometimes character death sometimes it's extremely uninteresting. The concept of getting bitten by a poison spider and having be so capricious isn't necessarily narratively exciting. But I think that the tension that runs through the concept of not only combat as war, but as the dungeon exploration as an unfair avenue of who knows what's going to happen. I do think the tension it builds an engagement investment with a certain type of player that's interesting.
Yeah. I do think, oh, bugger. I had something I wanted to say specifically. I'll think of it in a second.
Take your time. No problem.
Yeah.
I can talk for a minute. Although I am tempted to change the topic a little bit. But I will resist and give everybody time to think. It is interesting how the D&D 5e team was right early on in publishing so few adventures for D&D. And to old hands who were used to like this onslaught of books with a hardcover coming out every month that you can go and you can buy and spend and put on your bookshelf, to have like an adventure coming out every 6 months and that's it, felt like nothing for a long time. But I know one of the reasons they did that was because they wanted to create adventures that people actually played, where you could keep up with the content, and it allows, again, people to have conversations about what they played. All three of us have experiences with Curse of Strahd, and we can have a conversation about Curse of Strahd. It's really hard to do that. Can you think of a third edition adventure, Scott, that jumps out as like the iconic 3rd edition adventure?
Yeah, Sunless Citadel.
Sunless Citadel. That's a good answer. I haven't even read it. It came out in the first 2 years I know. Have you
That
played
is
Sunless
one
Citadel?
of the ones my brother played, and that's the only one I know.
I didn't. Again, the 3rd edition was where was the time that I took a lot of time off, and the only reason I know about that one is because I've heard people talk about it. I've always wanted to go back. I'm looking right now at the titles. I mean, I know more about these titles than I do having ever played, because but when I came back to D&D after a little bit of break, it was straight into Pathfinder, and then man, the Pathfinder adventures. I mean, I love Rise of the Rune Lords so much, and it's so beautiful. And then the Pathfinder rules really mess it up after you get about 5 modules in. But we digress. I mean, I might make the argument that if you talk about 3rd edition, and I'm looking at them right now. I mean, I've heard of was Red-Handed Doom one? Red-Handed Doom. That's another one that people throw around as being fantastic. A lot of these feel a little bit remakey.
I
Yeah.
remembered what I was going to say, but it'll keep.
No, just say it.
Well, it's a specifically like, because we're talking about old hat perspective, coming at it from new hat. I kind of got into it because people at college were playing D&D, but I also started listening to, not to pick at the wound, Ben, I'm sorry. I started listening to Matt Colville's original live game streams before I even got into Critical
Look,
Role.
Matt Colville is a genius.
He's great. I'm sorry.
That's why it
He's great.
stings
That's how I learned
so
how to run a
much.
game. Like, I'm sorry, but Critical Role is my age group's kind of touchstone. And in that we are kind of conditioned to the long-term storyline of the characters, seeing the beginning and the end. Like, yes, there's character death and rerolls, but it's so rare and such a huge plot point because their selling point is the storyline and their selling point is the characters in the arc. And a lot of people my age are getting into D&D because of that, or because they watch The Legend of Vox Machina on Amazon, which is great. It's beautiful. This is not, love it. But like we want that long storyline. We want our character to see the beginning to the end. And something else, this is gonna get a little soapboxy and niche, so cut me off. But people my age, we have terrible attention spans. We have terrible attention spans. And like we can't, and not only that, we don't, like, our schedules are weird. We live weird, eclectic lives because we're working 5 gigs, and so we can never play a game. So most of us don't even expect to see the end of a game ever at all. And so like the longevity of our characters is just such this weird mishmash of it should last forever, but also are we ever gonna play? So the character death feels more intense, I think, for us. And so we do tend to hesitate to like deal that out because like you've played this character 3 times, but actually it's been 6 months. And also like we want you to see the ending.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I was going to bring up is like, so how is the characters narrative? One of the things that I, when I was younger, I collected comic books, and I stopped reading comic books because one of the reasons that I couldn't, I still can't read comic books again is because of how, like there's not going to be the characters don't change, right?
No.
Like it always drives me crazy that Franklin Richards was like, Franklin Richards is the son of, by the way, my comic book knowledge. So all the people out there that are like nails on a chalkboard as I'm messing up whatever has happened to Marvel Comics since 1995 is, Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards and Susan Storm, was like, he was a baby for like 2 episodes, and then he's been 5 years old ever since. That always drove me crazy. It's interesting to me because like that, and that's the Critical Role. Like these characters are like Marvel characters, right? The concept is they're gonna have some changes. Their narrative arcs may change, but at the same time, generally they're safe unless they make some. And by the way, I don't. You started this, Madeleine, by saying that you guys have really short attentions. That you guys,
we do. No, we
all
do.
of you kids out there, you say that, but I can't get through an entire episode of Critical Role. Like I can't understand listening to a 4-hour episode of folks sitting around playing. So you can and
the only reason I did was because I was working at Target and I would put one headphone in my ear all day while I'm unpacking boxes. It's how I lived. It's how I got through it.
Yeah, we're gonna digress on this because what I've tried that. I used to try to put Critical Role on the same way that I'll put like a hockey podcast on, but I can't. But after 10 minutes, if like a hockey podcast, if I lose the thread of what they're talking about, no big deal. I'm not missing anything as big. It's like listening to the radio. But with a tabletop role-playing game, if I miss 5 minutes, I've lost track of what's going on at all.
Mm-hmm.
Does that happen,
That's
or is that okay? No, I mean I'm saying like that's why I stopped listening because I'm like, well, where the heck were they? I thought they were in a tavern. But that's like, does that not matter when you listen to like it's like more like you can come in and out. I guess I'm just curious.
No, it was really interesting because the only one I was able to do that with was campaign 2.
Sure.
I couldn't do it with the first campaign, and I never finished it, even though I loved it. I never finished it. I started campaign 3, and I guess maybe that happened after I was working in a school and had less time. But like, I was never able to listen to it the same way again. And I've kind of wondered if that was 1, Target brain, 2, pandemic brain, because I was eating, breathing, sleeping D&D and writing for D&D before I had I'm immunosuppressed, so I couldn't work for the first like good leg of the pandemic. So I was just doing D&D like 10 hours a day. Like I was writing, prepping, whatever.
Jeez.
And my brain has never been in that mode ever since.
So
I don't know. I feel like that might have been just like a niche point in my life where I could.
Yeah.
Because even the Matt Colville stuff that I started with, I never finished it.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry,
That's
Ben.
fine. The Matt Colville thing, I think now every time, like we've just half of our members are now on the floor if we're doing the shots.
We need
The
to
point,
figure out a way to
It's water,
cross.
I promise.
How do
I-
we continue this feud with Matt Colville?
yeah,
How do
I
we
don't want to
strike
be part
back?
of this feud with Matt Colville,
I know.
please.
Yeah, I've
Keep
never.
me out of it.
This is gonna
I
be
wanted
my.
to make a quick.
This is my road to greatness.
I want to quickly finish the point, the reason I was bringing up the Marvel characters before we started digressing, which is because I think it is like, well, Critical Role, it's in this Marvel concept of like the characters can change, but they can't really die. There should never be any type of danger. And like, we think of that as a new method, but it's not. I mean, if we go back to the Appendix N text, the major protagonists of the Appendix N text have quite a bit of plot armor, even if in Conan's case, they're wearing no armor at all. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Conan the Barbarian, Elric of Mel de Meday, all of these characters were not that different. So in some ways, it's very much a return to that concept, despite the fact that I don't dwell on either this. I don't like the Marvel slash Appendix N type of characters that have that kind of plot armor. I actually do dwell, and I tend to play the NPCs. I suppose the characters I like to play are the weird companions of Conan that last, a half of an I don't know if there's a Critical Role equivalent for that or not, but my characters are always the weird guys that kind of come in, do something cool, and then then they got bit by a spider.
Oh yeah, there's definitely. Yeah. I do want to say for any other critters watching this, I'm not saying the characters can't die isn't devastating. I just need to put that disclaimer out there because I'm still feeling the effects of a few of them. But it's just less common. It's less frequent. Wanted to leave that one out there.
Well, they have the exigency of Critical Role of having to keep people invested. I mean, this is a rather
people
large.
Have to want to watch.
It's a large commercial enterprise, right? So that's going to, and the bigger it gets, the bigger that it got from that first season, which was more of like a game. The more they're becoming entangled with what their audience is expecting.
No, they didn't. I don't believe they even started in 5th edition. I think that they transferred to 5th edition for the live stream. I believe it was a Pathfinder game first,
It was.
if I'm right.
You are right. Yep.
Yeah. Which I always wanted to delve into, and I just never got the chance. And I spent so much money on 5th edition. All my 3.5 books were hand-me-downs. I wouldn't spend more money.
5e is better than Pathfinder. Pathfinder is so math findery. Sorry, Ben.
It's okay. One of the great what ifs of gaming history has to be, what if Critical Role kept playing Pathfinder and didn't switch to 5th edition? Where would we be today?
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, how much do they lean on the rules anyway? I mean, I feel like they're so rules light in the way that they. I say that I haven't watched Critical Role. I should just. But I remember watching it and I was like,
I wouldn't say they're rules light. I would say that they do sometimes rule of cool, but not necessarily outside of the bounds of what is possible within the game. I also think that they've made enough of their own content and enough of their own additional core rules or et cetera, for the world of Exandria. I wouldn't say that they're like laissez-faire. They're creative.
I would throw out there that I like Scott, am amazed that Critical Role and actual plays are so popular, and yet they are so impenetrable to me. Like, I'm always like, well, I'd just rather go play. That's always kind of my thing. Like, I can listen to endless gaming podcasts about the games. I will gladly read gaming journalism. However, if it's like every time I sat down to watch Critical Role, which is only 3 times, I've gotten bored and clicked away.
Mm-hmm.
But again, when I talk to people under 30, so far, I think like 80% are, well, I got turned on to an actual play, and that's what led me to gaming. So it's really interesting that, again, it just speaks in some way to a younger generation, which is great as far as I'm concerned. Wonderful. Like, I'm not gonna
I don't know many people who actively watch Critical Role. I think most people listen. I could be wrong. But I'm a big I was an audiobook kid. Like, so just turning that on is old hat for me, I suppose. I think that for me personally as an actor, which might be a bit of a different perspective watching Critical Role, that's the other thing. I and all my friends are mostly actors or creative in some form with that. So we're also watching it for the artistic side of it. And we want to do voice work. And these are voice actors. And this is really fascinating that they're taking our hobby and turning it into what we want to do. So that's also like a weird layer that's niche for me. I don't know how much that translates either.
One of the things I do find interesting is growing up, I would have said my friends and I were much more actory than your generic D&D group. And that when I
Mhm.
sat down to play D&D with people I didn't know, it got really technical, really rules heavy, really fast, and that I generally found that boring. Uh, but it certainly seems like that is the kind of gaming that has won, or the style of gaming that has won, that people are trying to imitate. So that's interesting to me.
I've heard this from a number of okay, when I say a number, I literally mean two. But I've heard two folks that grew up that actually both are a little bit younger than me, but still grew up playing tabletop role-playing games. They probably came along or in the third edition. And both of them said that watching Critical Role has one person said the worst thing you can do for somebody trying to come into D&D is show them Critical Role because it completely messes up what their expectations are. And that was
I
similar to what
agree
the
with
second
that.
person said. It's interesting that you agree. These DMs were first of all, Critical Role has brought so many people to the hobby. Now, it does give unfair expectations necessarily. They're all going to be Matt Colville. I mean, the funny thing is like like the way that I run my games is kind of an OSR method. I'd like to lean on rulings. I'm terrible at rules. It's been my Achilles heel. When it comes to players, I expect them to know what the character rules for all their characters because I can't keep them all straight. I've been running 5e. I've run 5e for pay, and I still don't even understand how spell slots works entirely. I have to read that, and also I'm old, so I like forget it
I
as
don't
soon
know
as
what a
I
spell
let
modifier is really.
it. Yeah. Um, but the expectation of what Matt Colville does is unbelievable. No DM can kind of come to that level, merging that mastery of the rules along with the performance that he does. I don't know if I agree necessarily though, because I think it's such the thing that I like about Critical Role is it so displays how much fun you can have playing the game. And I think in some ways
Mhm.
it demystifies. It certainly changed what people think about the demographics of the type of players for,
Oh
Dungeons and
yeah.
Dragons, right? And it makes it acceptable. And the fun that they show, I think, is really, really, really good. But every game is so different. I remember playing D&D in the 80s. There were a lot of now it is expected that every DM does voices, which I find hilarious. I mean, when we played D&D in the 80s and 90s, I would say there were a few DMs who would, you'd hear the Scottish accent from time to time when they were doing a dwarf, but there was a lot of times where they would just say, the barkeep says this. He would never role play the barkeep. And it was like, in some ways, some games I played in were very much like giant tactical, it was like a little bit of narrative context to explain why we're doing the battle. But that was as much as we were dealing with. Certainly the performance could be really small. Of course, it always, and I'm sure there's still
Yeah.
games, there's a lot of games that are still like that.
I came down hard on the I agree with that, and I should say I don't fully agree with that. That was a little bit of a so
Sure.
there's this thing, it's a thing. It's a thing that has been named, and like I wrote a paper about it at one point a long time ago called the Matt Mercer effect. Um for DMs specifically. And that's why I initially said that because I don't think people okay, I want to rephrase that. You shouldn't become a DM just by watching Critical Role.
Sure.
That's what I agree with. You should not just watch Critical Role and go, oh, I can and will do that immediately because you're going to be so
Right.
stressed. Because I did it and I was so stressed out.
Yeah, the bar is way high. I mean, I've been DMing for 30 years now, and I'm not as good of a DM as Matt Colville
Oh
is.
God, yeah. And Matt Mercer has a team of
Or
people helping
Matt
him
Mercer is
now.
my Matt. Yeah.
Like, yeah, and like he's amazing. He's incredible. Not to like downplay what he does, but he does have people helping him. No DM in their basement or in a garage or whatever. Like you're not gonna have those resources. And even then, like you have your own play style. So I think that players definitely watch Critical Role to get into it. DMs do watch it, but then like make sure you like just know that that's not like it doesn't have to be that way to be good.
Yeah, and it's the other thing too. I mean, the one thing I think is, as I mentioned before, they've got a commercial exigency that they're thinking about that, so they are very well aware that they're performing for an audience, right? And one of the best things about Dungeons and Dragons is that the performers are the audience. So Critical Role in many ways is different than your average Dungeons and Dragons game because they have an explicit outside audience from what they're doing. And I think one of the things that's fun about Dungeons and Dragons is that no, there's secret in jokes. There's really goofy things that you wouldn't want other people. Dungeons and Dragons is like writing is like things that should be done in private and nobody should see you doing them, because because they do allow that. I've said this many times. I think that tabletop role playing game, the practice of tabletop role playing games, is in many ways one of the most intimate practices that you can do, which is we can have a longer conversation around in many with I don't run a lot of session zeros. And I do a kind of truncated one, but not the one that's explicit that a lot of other folks do, because I wouldn't play tabletop role-playing games, at least not a long-term campaign with people that I didn't really know well enough to begin with, because I think the practice of it is so weirdly intimate that I really wouldn't want to play with a lot of strangers. I don't like to play with folks that I don't know actually really well, which is why I find Critical Role and these performative let's play things so strange, because I feel like I feel like a voyeur when I watch these things. I'm like, I don't want to watch you guys play this game. It's too personal.
I am super picky as a DM. I have like, and again, like my first game, I just kind of opened it up to people, and that wasn't a great experience. And ever since then, like I pick like, who do I know
Yeah.
I'm gonna get along with, and then I go, okay, are you gonna get along with this person? Are you gonna get along with this person? It's like crossing the streams. You got to be super careful.
I've thought about
Like
this
it's like
recently. Yeah.
introducing a significant other to a friend group. You got to be so careful.
You're hitting a nerve right now. I know lots of people that play
Mhm.
tabletop role-playing games. Recently, I was putting a game together, and I'm like, I don't know who would work in this game. And
Yeah, it's
it's
scary.
funny. It's hard to put together a game.
It's like seating people at a wedding.
It is. It's like those old logic puzzles. Like John can sit next to Sadie, but Sadie can't sit next to anybody that wears glasses. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, John really hates the 5e rule set, so we can't play that, and he's a performative type person, so we can't merge him with Norm, who only likes tactical war games. It's weird. And then and you're also dealing with two sets of frames, right? You're dealing with the frame of like what do they like in the game, but you're also thinking in terms of like who do they not like, and because the social, and that's something a Critical Role doesn't have. It doesn't have. They're all, well, first of all, they're all friends, but the game, I don't know if they cut it out and or it's just not a part of it.
Yeah.
They're not talking about what happened at work, or they're not
Yeah.
talking about, they don't have that social thing that's so much a part of playing tabletop role-playing games, which is those pauses and talking about. My Curse of Strahd game is a lot of folks that, they're folks that I went to, well, not did I studied under at my school, and we pause the game and we start talking about theories of play in the middle of the game, and that to me is not outside the game. It's a different frame,
Mm.
but it's still part of the game. I still think tabletop role-playing games, that social aspect is absolutely an embedded part of the experience.
I'm not gonna dig too deeply into it because the creators of Critical Role have like asked me not to talk about it, but there was an eighth player for a while in the original game, Orion Akaba, who they did have table issues with and who is no longer part of the franchise. There was other like legal issues, but like that's the thing. It's a social contract. Every game that you enter into, it is a social contract at the table
Mhm.
with everyone there. And there's nets.
And there's nets. And that's a fine ending, actually.
Smooth wraparound.
So, Madeline, we're hoping that we get more dramatic readings from you over the course of this podcast. Um, is there any way people can support you? I don't know if that's true, but is there any way listeners can support you?
Uh, I don't really have social media because I think it's exhausting.
You're not wrong. It is exhausting.
Watch this podcast because I'll be on it
There
sometimes.
you go. Watch
If
watch
something
here
comes
for
up, I'll let you know.
there we go. And listeners, if you want to support this podcast, it's $3 a month. We have a Discord, which I actually participate in. So,
Under duress.
talk to me. Tell me that Matt Colville's amazing, and I should apologize to him publicly for the things I said, like that he was a genius communicator and one of the greatest evangelists of D&D in the history of the game. But that wasn't what I said that irritated him, I'm sure. But in fairness, we all need to do what gets us through the day. I'm sorry I rattle his cage that much. I like Matt Colville. Anyway, Scott, Are we gonna we have to group read your dissertation this summer?
No. Oh gosh, no. This literally that would end the podcast. The viewership would go, what are they doing?
I could get some actors in. We could do a dramatic rendition.
If you can do a dramatic rendition, especially about the first chapter where you go over the concept of double slit experiments and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum reality, that would be fascinating. And yeah, I mean,
Challenge
absolutely
accepted.
mangling of actual quantum physics. I'm always terrified of a real quantum physicist reading my dissertation and being like, my gosh, man.
A real quantum physicist. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say good night, all. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
No, thanks for being on, Madeleine.
Our pleasure.